Ever find yourself in one of those situations where you just need to learn something like immediately?
Like walking into a meeting,
Yeah, maybe a meeting, maybe it's a new project, you got to get up to speed.
and there's like so much information.
There is, right. You just want to cut through it all and get to the most important parts.
Totally.
And you wish you could just like snap your fingers and have that understanding, right?
Exactly.
That's kind of what we do here on the deep dive, right? We help people make sense of information quickly and thoroughly.
Yeah. We take all those resources like articles and notes, anything you're working with, and we try to pull out the really important knowledge.
So it's like a shortcut to becoming an expert without having to wade through all those details,
I
right?
love that. A shortcut.
So today, we're going to do this deep dive based on some notes you sent over.
Yes.
And these notes focus on two really important skills that are crucial for how we learn and how we understand things,
Hmm.
which are the ability to ask good questions and the ability to explain things clearly.
Two very essential skills, definitely.
Now, these notes come from the world of teaching, but the stuff we're going to talk about today is super valuable, whether you're at work, communicating with your team, or even just having those deeper conversations in everyday life,
Oh, yeah.
Our goal today is to help you refine these skills so you can become a better thinker, a more precise communicator, and just approach learning in a more effective way.
Yeah, I love it.
So let's get started. Let's talk about questions.
Okay.
So much of learning, and teaching for that matter, is about giving information. Right.
Hmm.
But your notes point out right away that asking questions is just as, if not more, important.
Oh, absolutely. And right at the beginning, there's this awesome quote from Ryburn. It says, "It's no exaggeration to say that a teacher's success hinges on their ability to question well."
So powerful. Right.
It's so true, though. When you think about it, real understanding often starts with curiosity.
Right.
And good questions, they keep that curiosity burning.
Absolutely. And Raymond, he actually calls developing a good questioning style like an essential ambition.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who's involved in education, it really emphasizes that asking questions, it's not just about getting an answer.
Right.
It's a skill that needs to be honed, it needs to be practiced.
Totally.
And it's not just for teachers or educators either, right? Remember those 6 honest serving men?
Oh, yes. What, why, when, how, where, who.
Exactly. Those are the fundamental questions that underpin how we all gain knowledge.
Yeah,
And they're so simple, but so powerful, right?
absolutely.
Think about it. When was the last time you were in a situation where you felt confused or lost
Yeah.
about something? Did you, like, actually go through those 6 questions systematically?
That's such a good point.
Often the deepest understanding, like the real breakthroughs, come from revisiting those basic questions.
I think so often we forget about the simple questions. We want to jump to the complex stuff.
We do. We get ahead of ourselves. Okay, so your notes also dig into like why we ask questions in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's not just about testing someone's knowledge.
Right. It's so much more than that.
Questions can be used to build a connection, to figure out what someone already knows, to keep them interested, to clear up confusion.
And to actually figure out how well they understand something, too.
Exactly. Like if you're trying to quickly learn something new, thinking about what types of questions you should be asking, like what questions will help me understand this most efficiently, that can be a huge help.
That's really smart.
Now, one thing that I found really interesting was how the notes outline these different purposes of questions at different stages of learning, like when you're introducing a new topic, when
Right.
you're presenting information, when you're applying that knowledge, and then finally when you're wrapping it all up. And it's like you can almost see how that applies to any situation, not just a formal lesson, right?
Oh, for sure.
It's like you start by making a connection, making sure everyone's on the same page with their existing knowledge.
Right.
Then you move on to presenting the new information, keeping it engaging, making sure everyone's following along. Then you focus on how to apply that information, making sure there's no confusion there.
Yeah.
And finally, you summarize, you confirm everyone's understanding.
That's a really adaptable framework. I like that.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so we've talked about why asking good questions is so important. Now let's get into the how. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of how to structure a good question.
Okay, let's do it. This is where those notes get super practical, which is great. So they define structure as basically the grammar and the content of your questions. So a well-structured question, it has to be grammatically correct, of course.
Right.
It should be relevant to what you're talking about. Specific, concise, and clear.
It seems so simple, but so many questions miss the mark on one of those.
They really do. I even catch myself doing it sometimes.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. And the notes have a nice, simple example to illustrate this. They compare, asking, where is Pratap born versus where was Pratap born. It's a small tweak,
Right.
but it makes a difference. It just shows how important it is to get the basics right.
Absolutely. And then the notes go on to highlight what we should avoid,
Right.
which I think is just as important. Like, nobody enjoys those yes or no questions that kind of just kill the conversation.
Oh, yeah, they just shut it down.
Or those leading questions where you're subtly trying to steer someone towards a particular answer, which is not really fair. The notes give a great example with Newton.
Oh, yeah. Newton invented the law of cooling, didn't he?
Right. It's like you're already leading them toward a yes.
Exactly.
And then there's the double-barreled questions where you're trying to ask two things at once, which is always a recipe for confusion.
Like the example in the notes is about asking about density and relative density in the same question.
Yeah, it's just too much at once.
Too much. And finally, those ambiguous questions, which are probably the most frustrating of all, right?
Yeah, like, what about Newton's laws of motion?
It's like, where do I even begin?
So broad. Or like, what about banks? It's just so vague.
So vague.
The notes rightly emphasize that being specific is key. Like, instead of saying, what about Newton's laws of motion, ask, what are the 3 laws of motion?
Much better.
Much better. And instead of, what about banks? Or try, what are the different functions of a bank? Being specific means there's a single, clear answer, which makes the exchange smoother and also just encourages clear, focused thinking.
And concise questions as well.
Oh, yeah.
Getting straight to the point without all that unnecessary fluff.
For sure.
The notes contrast, asking which is the most important duty of a teacher, with a much longer, drawn-out version of the same question. And it's like, just get to the heart of it.
Yeah, don't waste time. And then lastly, there's clarity. The language you use has to be appropriate for the person you're talking to. So the notes compare what problems accompany industrialization in a country with what problems arise when industries are developed in a country. And it's like, just make it as easy as possible for them to understand what you're asking.
So important. So we've talked about the structure.
Right.
That's kind of the foundation of asking a good question.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to the process.
Okay.
The process of asking a question. And there are 3 key things the notes highlight here. The speed at which you ask, the level of the question, and how you use your voice.
I like it.
Okay, so speed.
Yeah.
This is such a delicate balance, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to throw questions out there so fast that people can't process them. But you don't want to drag it out so long that people lose interest.
It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. And the notes point out that the speed should really depend on a few things.
Yeah.
Your natural speaking pace, for one, but also the complexity of the question.
Yeah.
So lower level questions, we'll talk about those in a minute, but those often require less thought.
Yeah.
So you can ask those a bit quicker. But for higher level questions, the ones that require more analysis, you need to slow down.
Yeah.
Give people time to think and come up with their answers.
Right.
Think about it. If you're asking someone to just recall a fact, you can probably ask that pretty quickly. But if you're asking them to, like, compare and contrast two complex concepts, they're going to need some time.
I need time to process.
And the purpose of your question also matters, right? If you're just doing a quick review or trying to jog someone's memory, a faster pace is fine. But if you're prompting deep thought, you're going to need to adjust.
Then there's your voice, which is so crucial when you're asking questions. And the notes break this down into 2 main components, audibility and modulation.
Okay.
Audibility is pretty straightforward.
Make sure everyone can hear you.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone
Yeah.
needs to be able to hear you clearly.
Especially in a larger setting, right?
Exactly. But then there's modulation, which is how you use your voice, the changes in your intonation, the emphasis you put on certain words. And it's amazing how modulation can completely change the meaning of a question.
Oh, yeah.
For example, think about the simple phrase, "You think so?" The way you say it, whether your voice goes up at the end or down, can make it sound like a genuine question or like you're expressing doubt.
Right.
It's a subtle thing, but it makes a huge difference.
It can completely change the tone, too.
Yeah.
Go from being curious to being almost challenging.
Right. So your voice, it's not just about volume, it's about conveying your intention and inviting a response.
Okay, so we've covered structure. We've covered process. What's the final piece of this puzzle when it comes to asking good questions?
The final piece is the product. And in this context, product means the response you get. And the notes make a really important point here.
Okay.
Sometimes, even when you ask a well-structured, well-delivered question, you might not get the answer you expected, or any answer at all.
Right.
And the notes offer some possible reasons for this.
Okay.
Maybe the person just doesn't understand the question.
Hmm.
Maybe they're not paying attention.
Right.
Maybe they can't connect the question to what they already know. Or maybe there's just a lack of rapport.
Hmm.
And it's a reminder that if you're not getting the answers you want, it's worth looking at the bigger picture.
Right.
Like, is the environment comfortable? Is there trust?
Instead of just assuming the other person doesn't know.
Exactly.
Maybe your question wasn't clear enough.
Right, right.
Or maybe something's making them hesitant to answer.
Hmm.
So it's important to think about the whole context.
I agree.
Okay, so the notes then move into this really interesting breakdown of different levels of classroom questioning.
Hmm.
And I think this framework is super useful for thinking about the types of thinking you're trying to encourage with your questions in any situation, not just in a classroom. Okay, so there are 3 levels: lower order, middle order, and higher order.
Hmm.
And each level corresponds to a different level of cognitive engagement.
Okay.
So let's start with lower order questions. What kind of thinking do those usually involve?
So lower order questions, they're primarily about recall and recognition. Those are the foundational levels of understanding.
Okay.
Recall is simply remembering and stating facts like when was Gandhi born, or what's the definition of velocity, or what are the stages of a river. It's retrieving information that's already been learned.
And recognition is about identifying information you've encountered before.
Right, exactly. So the examples given are like being able to pick out adjectives in a sentence, or being able to find rice-producing states on a map.
Right, so these are the basics,
Yeah.
the facts that form the foundation for more complex thinking.
Think about when you're learning something totally new. Usually you start by memorizing key terms and concepts.
Right.
That's lower order thinking in action.
Okay, so then we move up to the middle order questions.
Hmm.
These require a bit more brain power.
Right, a little bit more.
And they involve things like transition,
Mm.
which is basically being able to represent a concept in a different way.
Yeah.
So the notes give some cool examples like expressing the feeling of sorrow through poetry, through painting, through music, or describing what a model represents, or even just thinking about how you would depict happiness in a picture. It's taking an idea and expressing it in a new form.
That's a really great way to test understanding, too.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you can take an idea and express it in a different medium, that shows a deeper level of understanding than just being able to define it.
Absolutely. And then there's comparison. So comparing things like India's foreign policies under different leaders, and then there's explaining relationships, like how prices are connected to supply and demand.
Right.
These all involve some analysis, being able to see the connections between different elements. And then there's application, which is basically taking what you know and putting it into practice.
Yeah.
So the example the notes use is figuring out what kind of industrial unit could be successful in a specific region based on the resources that are available. So you're taking knowledge and applying it to a real-world scenario.
And that's something we do all the time, right? Think about problem solving at work. You're always applying existing knowledge to new challenges.
Totally, totally. Okay, so lower order is about remembering and recognizing. Middle order is about reinterpreting, comparing, explaining connections, and applying knowledge.
Right.
So that brings us to the highest level, the higher order questions.
Right.
What kind of thinking are we trying to stimulate with these?
Higher order questions, they're designed to encourage the most advanced levels of thinking. So things like analysis, breaking down an idea into its parts, seeing how they connect. Then there's synthesis, which is taking different pieces of information, different ideas, and putting them together in a new way.
Right.
Like when you're brainstorming or coming up with a new strategy, that's synthesis. And then lastly, there's evaluation, which is about judging the value of something based on certain criteria.
Okay.
And the examples given in the notes are, is science a boon or a bane to humankind? Why is democracy considered better than autocracy? These are questions that really force you to think critically,
Right.
to look at things from multiple perspectives, and to draw your own conclusions.
And while the notes present these in the context of education, it's so easy to see how they apply to all sorts of situations.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
If you're trying to understand a complex problem at work, if you need to come up with an innovative solution,
Right.
or if you have to make a difficult decision, These levels of questioning are constantly at play.
And the notes also provide some super helpful guidelines for asking effective questions, specifically for teachers.
Things like planning your questions in advance.
Oh.
Pausing after you ask a question, which is so important.
Hmm.
Only rephrasing if it's absolutely necessary. Really listening to the responses. Asking follow-up questions to help people dig a little deeper. Redirecting questions to involve more people. And encouraging complete, thoughtful answers. And while these are geared toward teachers, you can see how these same principles apply to any kind of communication.
Oh, absolutely. Planning what you want to ask, giving people time to think, actually listening to what they say, asking follow-up questions to get more detail. These are valuable skills in any setting.
Okay, so that was a pretty deep dive into the art and science of asking good questions. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the skill of explaining things well.
I like it because asking insightful questions, it's only half the battle, right?
Exactly. You also need to be able to communicate your own ideas effectively.
Yeah.
To explain things clearly so other people understand. And the notes actually start by highlighting the ongoing challenge that teachers face when it comes to explaining complex ideas in a way that makes them easy to grasp. And they say that a good explanation is one that's easily understood.
Right.
And that relies on clear, logical communication. They also offer this really concise definition of an explanation. A set of interconnected and relevant statements designed to increase understanding. So often describing the how, the when, and sometimes the what of a concept. So it's like you're building a bridge of understanding between what someone already knows and this new information you're giving them. And just like with questioning, the notes break down explanation into desirable behaviors, the things you should strive for, and undesirable behaviors, things you should avoid. So let's start with the good stuff, the hallmarks of a great explanation.
Okay.
So the first one is using appropriate introductory statements. Why are these so crucial?
Well, introductory statements are like setting the stage. You're telling people, okay, this is what we're going to talk about.
Right.
It helps create mental alertness. It gets people ready to listen. It's like giving them a roadmap so they know where the explanation is headed.
Right, so they can follow along.
Exactly.
Okay, the next one is voice, which is so important, both in asking questions and in giving explanations. It's not just about the words, it's about the delivery.
It's everything.
And the notes talk about how varying your pitch, your tone, and your volume can emphasize the important parts.
Oh, absolutely.
And using pauses before a key point. Repeating something for emphasis. Changing your speed. All of these can help people understand better.
And even things like gestures, using your hands, your body language can make a difference.
It all contributes to a more effective explanation. So using your voice dynamically to highlight information, keep your audience engaged.
Right.
That's key. Okay? The third desirable behavior is language. So how do we use language effectively when we're explaining something?
So the main thing is to use language that's appropriate for your audience, keep your sentences short and simple, and really make use of what the notes call explaining links.
Explaining links?
Which are basically words and phrases that explicitly show the connections between ideas. So these are your conjunctions, your prepositions, that indicate cause, consequence, means, or purpose.
Okay.
Words like therefore, hence, thus, because, so that, due to, why, while. Using these words makes your explanation clearer and helps your listener follow the logic.
They're like signposts that guide your listener through your explanation.
Exactly.
Okay, what's the next desirable behavior for getting a great explanation?
The next one is using concluding statements.
Concluding statements.
So this is about bringing your explanation to a close. Summarizing the key points.
Okay.
It helps reinforce what you've said and makes the information stick.
Okay.
It's kind of like wrapping up a presentation with a nice summary of the main takeaways.
A nice little bow on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, then there's covering all the essential points. What does that mean exactly?
It means making sure your explanation is comprehensive enough to address all the relevant aspects of what you're explaining. So if there are multiple key features or ideas that are connected, A complete explanation will cover them all.
Right.
It won't leave out important details.
Okay, and then there's defining any technical terms.
Oh, yeah, that's super important.
It might seem obvious, but
Well, we forget.
it's easy to slip up, right?
It is.
And use jargon or specialized terms that your audience might not be familiar with. So if you're using technical language,
Right.
take the time to explain what those terms mean.
Especially early on in your explanation. Otherwise, those unfamiliar words, they can become like major roadblocks.
They can. And then we have sequencing,
Hmm.
which is about presenting information in a logical order.
Exactly. Whether you're explaining a process that has steps
Right.
or historical events that happened in a certain order or a cause and effect relationship or even just describing the layout of a space,
Right.
presenting things in a logical sequence is essential for clarity.
It's like you're guiding your listener through the information in a way that makes sense.
Exactly.
And finally, the last desirable behavior is checking for understanding. So how can we do that effectively?
So after you've given an explanation, you want to make sure your audience actually understood it. So you can ask questions to get feedback, see if you were successful, and give them a chance to ask for clarification on anything they didn't get.
Right. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the good habits, the things we want to aim for when giving explanations.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the undesirable behaviors,
Okay.
the things we want to steer clear of. So first up, irrelevant statements. Why are those so bad for a good explanation?
They're basically distractions. They take your listener away from the main point and can cause unnecessary confusion. They disrupt the flow of your explanation and make it harder for your listener to stay focused on what's important.
It's like going off on tangents in a conversation.
Exactly.
You lose people.
You lose them.
So keep it focused, stick to the topic.
Absolutely.
Okay, another undesirable behavior is a lack of continuity. So what does that look like in an explanation?
It happens when there are breaks in your train of thought. Like if you suddenly switch to an unrelated topic,
Right.
or you jump back to something you talked about earlier without making a clear connection, it's hard for the listener to follow the logic.
Right.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing.
It disrupts the flow. It's hard to see how everything fits together. Okay. Then we have a lack of fluency in your delivery. How did that show up in an explanation?
This can manifest in a few ways, like mumbling, speaking unclearly, not finishing your sentences,
Right.
starting and stopping a lot, rephrasing things constantly, or just using a lot of filler words like and It makes your explanation sound disorganized, and it can make your listener question whether you really know what you're talking about.
It makes you sound less confident, less sure of yourself.
Exactly.
And the final undesirable behavior is using inappropriate vocabulary or just vague words and phrases. So what falls into this category?
Using technical terms your audience doesn't understand without defining them,
Right.
or relying on vague words like, in fact, you see, somewhat. These words don't really add any meaning, and they can actually make your message less clear.
They can. So clarity and precision in your language are key.
Absolutely.
Know your audience, use language they'll understand. The notes also offer some really helpful tips for giving successful explanations. So what are some of the takeaways there?
So they stress that good explanations are brief, they're relevant to the topic, and they use precise language. They're selective about what needs explaining.
Right.
They focus on the essentials. They're accurate, they're simple, they're clear, they're systematic, and they use visual aids whenever possible to illustrate those connections, those complex concepts. And finally, your presentation should feel natural and engaging, and you should always be ready to answer any questions,
Right.
any doubts that come up.
So those are great guidelines for improving our ability to explain things clearly.
I think so.
Okay, so we've taken this deep dive into asking good questions and giving clear explanations, drawing out the key principles from these really insightful notes. And what's so striking is how interconnected these two skills are.
Oh yeah, they go hand in hand.
They're fundamental to teaching and learning, but they're also crucial for effective communication in all aspects of our lives.
Yeah, no matter what you do, these skills are essential.
Absolutely. And what's so cool is that these principles can be applied in so many different contexts, not just the traditional classroom setting.
Yeah, for sure.
Whether you're learning something new, leading a discussion at work, or even just trying to get your point across in a personal conversation.
Mm.
Thinking about how you ask questions and how you explain things can make a world of difference.
It really can.
So, to our listener, here are the key takeaways. Asking effective questions. It involves thinking about structure,
Mm.
process,
Mm.
and the kind of thinking you're trying to encourage.
Mm.